this is the mind-body problem, which is thousands of years old in philosophy, and yet our own inner awareness is the very first thing that we come upon. It's the basis upon which all science and all philosophy exists. It would seem to be less of a mystery than a bedrock.
Indeed. You might say that consciousness is at once the most familiar thing in the world and the most mysterious. Consciousness is what we start with. When it comes to knowing the world and looking out at the world, consciousness is what we have first. Everything else is secondary. I know that I exist. I know that I'm conscious. I think you probably exist, and there's a physical world out somewhere behind that. So in terms of what's familiar to me, gosh, consciousness is number one. But then in terms of accommodating that within a scientific worldview, it's fascinating that we've actually turned out to make much more progress on understanding such distant phenomena as subatomic particles or distant stars, not to mention the phenomena of chemistry, of biology, and of life, than we have of understanding our own consciousness. It almost sticks out like a sore thumb in the scientific picture. How is it that all these physical processes in the world should be associated with conscious experiences? And that's a problem which science, despite the familiarity of the phenomenon, has been almost silent on.
Well, to me, it's a paradox that you can't, to my way of thinking, you can't have science without consciousness, and yet scientists would maintain that they can they expect that they could arrive at a pretty complete picture of the universe that doesn't involve consciousness.
Right, indeed. So to do any consciousness, you've got to start, to do any science, you've got to start with a conscious mind. All the fundamental data we deal with are data of our experience. But it's interesting, science is so hooked on the idea of being, we're so hooked on the idea that to do proper science, you have to be objective. You have to eliminate anything subjective from the picture to build up a scientific framework. If every last remnant of consciousness, of subjective experience in those data gets eliminated, and we push our theory, you give a scientific theory, for example, of heat or of light, and you give a theory of these physical phenomena of molecules moving fast in a hot object. One gives a theory of all the objective aspects of heat. One leaves out actually the very central subjective aspect of hotness. Science doesn't actually give a theory of the conscious feeling of hotness. The one has to eradicate the subjective to give these objective theories. If so, then when it comes to that works for a lot of phenomena. When it comes to giving a theory of consciousness itself, which is the paradigmatically subjective phenomenon, it seems that it may be that the methods of science have to be expanded.
Well, let's take this as an example, because almost every science student will learn that we have heat sensors that are part of our nervous system. They become activated. They send neural impulses up from the sensor along the nerves into the brain, and therefore we feel or perceive that heat. You're saying that doesn't really explain it.
Well, I think that you can tell a nice scientific story about what happens when the stuff in the environment hits the heat sensors. It sends a story up the optic nerve, and something happens in the brain, and some neurons wiggle up there, and so on. And then you said the last step, and therefore we feel it. Now that's the interesting step. How does that happen? How do those neurons firing and wiggling away inside the brain suddenly give rise to this subjective experience of hotness, the feeling of heat? Nothing in the scientific story, it seems, tells you why that has to happen. How does the water of the brain turn into the wine of consciousness? As far as everything in the scientific story is concerned, consciousness might as well not be there, it seems. From the third, we might as well just be giant, unconscious automata, zombies, functioning in the world, reacting to those heat sensors, reacting to it, sweating a little bit maybe, and moving away. Why do we need conscious subjective experience in that picture?
And classically, the mind-body problem is something like this. How do you take atoms and molecules and physical substances that possess no consciousness whatsoever, and from that derive consciousness? That's the classic problem, as I understand it.
That's precisely it. How is it that all of this matter adds up to something as complex and as interesting and as unique somehow as consciousness? That works so well in so many other domains, the method of explanation by reduction, trying to explain, take a high-level phenomenon like life and reproduction and give an explanation of it in terms of low-level phenomena such as and how DNA transmits information, stores information, transmits it from one generation to the next, plays a role in the development of an organism. Eventually one gets a developing organism which grows and reproduces and adapts, and one gets a nice scientific explanation of life. That method works so well in so many domains. What's interesting is when it comes to applying that to consciousness, it seems to some extent we're banging our head against a brick wall. When it comes to some phenomena, such as the phenomena of explaining how it is, the objective phenomena of explaining how it is we react, and we talk, and we integrate information, and so on, those problems, which I called earlier the easy problems, right? It seems that the kind of reductionist methods at least have some promise there. When it comes to the problem of explaining why all that physical stuff should be accompanied by a subjective experience, that seems as a different kind of question. It's what some philosophers have called an explanatory gap between the physical level and the level of consciousness. 'Cause no number, 10 neurons, 100 neurons, 1,000 neurons, 1,000 billion neurons, no matter how complex, nothing in that story seems to tell you why it is that anything should ever have a subjective feeling to it.
Well, of course, in recent decades, it seems as if there's been a big movement amongst the in philosophy, amongst the positivists and those who are students of, I believe it's Gilbert Ryle, when I was an undergraduate in college, we all read Gilbert Ryle, who pointed out to us that we had made a categorical mistake, that the problem of consciousness wasn't really a problem at all. It was a semantic problem, and if we'd only learn how to think about it differently, we would see that. They sort of have suggested that all of these centuries of agonizing about the problem was misguided.
There's a great tradition, actually, in philosophy and psychology, especially this century, of just that, of denying the problem. And you can see a certain motivation for it. It certainly makes life a lot easier if that problem's not around. So earlier this century, for example, in psychology, there was the behaviorist movement that said to study the mind, all we're going to do is study behavior. All else is off limits. That allows the possibility, arguably, of an objective science of the mind, at cost, though, it seemed to many, of denying the most central phenomenon about the mind, the most central fact about the mind, which is that we are subjectively conscious. And psychology has gradually moved away from that. In philosophy, it's interesting. Even more recently in philosophy, there's been a big movement to say, well, as philosophers these days, we're not going to be caught up in those ancient mysteries. We're going to be scientific. We're going to try and adapt our philosophy to the scientific worldview, and therefore we're going to deny any of these interesting, mysterious questions, which seem to lead us into the trap of being unscientific somehow. So, the movement of logical positivism, for example, in the 1940s, and philosophical behaviorism in the 1950s and 1960s, there was a groundswell towards just saying, okay, there's no problem here. It's all just a big semantic confusion. What's interesting, though, is actually in more recent years, I think, especially over the last 5 or 10 years, people have begun to realize, well, we almost convinced ourselves that there was no problem. Life was beginning to look a lot simpler, but the more you think about it, you realize, gosh, the problem just hasn't gone away. It's like that, that nagging itch. You can forget about for a while, and it comes back.
The leading proponent of reminding people that they haven't gotten rid of the problem. Some of the cognitive theorists have said, well, if we can solve all the little problems, and then you add that all up, that's it. That's consciousness.
That's right. But what's interesting, actually, is when people don't talk about this stuff a whole lot. What's interesting, when you actually press people on it, when you talk people about it, almost everybody knows that there's a big problem here that we haven't yet solved. People have different attitudes towards it. Some people say, well, gosh, we can't even begin to solve that one yet. We'll work on all these simpler problems first. Other people say, well, sure, there's a problem there, but it's not science anyway. Gosh, I mean, it's subjective. It's not science, so we shouldn't need to worry about it. Some people deny there's a problem, but it's interesting that when I go around there, actually, sometimes I do surveys, whether it's psychologists, neuroscientists, and philosophers. 3 out of 4 people say, gosh, there's a very serious problem here, which isn't being addressed by the current methods. What's interesting is, for the most part, people don't talk about it, and at least until very recently. And in recent years, people have actually started to talk about consciousness a little bit more centrally, and some of these problems are being brought directly into people's attention. I think we're now entering into an exciting period where, for a long time, there's been a few little people here and there struggling away, making a little bit of progress, and little theories here and there on the problem. Now I think we're coming to a point where maybe we're going to see a more concerted effort for a number of people from different disciplines.
At the end of the 20th century, it's probably fair to say that we don't have yet a scientific theory of consciousness.
I think that's absolutely correct. I mean, indeed, it's about as much of a problem that can sometimes seem as it ever was. We have a great theory of the brain. Or we don't have a great theory of the brain, but we have a pretty good theory, pretty good beginning theory.
We know about neurotransmission.
Brain interact with each other, and what area does what, and rough principles of information processing that tells us what's responsible for vision, for language, and so on. Nothing in that has yet given us much insight to why that should be accompanied by subjective experience. And the interesting question, of course, is what it is we have to do, what it is we have to add to a theory to get consciousness in there.